to record on my computer, and it'll probably pop up a little something on your end.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have to accept it or not. I think it just...
No, it just seems it's going on its own.
Cool.
Sure.
So, yeah, you sent me that link, but from my understanding, you basically want to talk about like philosophy of healthcare and...
Sure. Well, it's I guess I've just sort of had a variety of interests. I was more wondering what I don't know what people who watch your podcast are sort of interested in, because I've worked with some AI in radiology, which that's also quite cool to talk about. But mostly it's sort of where's medicine going in the face of science, and like what does that do to the human element in care, which is kind of quite a specific thing. I
Right.
actually got a kind of a really funny email today, because there's this journal feed thing which sends regular emergency medicine articles, and
Mhm.
sort of today's title was 5 Ways to Connect with Your Patients, and
Okay.
and it's like the list is sort of: be present, prepare with intention, listen intently and completely, agree on what matters most, connect to the patient's story, and explore emotional cues. And you sort of read this and you're like, it looks like a 8-year-old wrote it, like
Right.
and that's where the humanities and medicine sort of split in like the 1980s, 1970s. Like science took over, and like we're sitting with a system of the medical humanities, which is pretty much we'll do the science as doctors and you take care of yourself. But now we've got this, the advent of AI, you've got the advent of bioengineering, you've got the advent of sort of science-based care, which is really not care, but science-based prediction of outcomes. So, we're more and more able to predict outcomes, and the problems in medicine are becoming less and less, what can we cure and what can't we cure, but, who trusts doctors? The major healthcare news in the last few years is, say, the vaccine crisis,
Mm.
which has hit everyone, which is not a problem of science. It's a
No.
problem of trust. And we're having, we have these two worlds, like the world of science and the world of techno-science, technology, technique. I don't know if you've been following any of Johannes Niederhauser's talks on Heidegger. And then you've got the world of, the softer side, which is
Right.
sort of what we call the softer side, the caring, intimacy, and relationships between doctors and patients.
What was the name of that guy who talks about the lecture again?
Sorry, which?
You mentioned a name.
Oh, so Justin Murphy and Johannes Niederhauser have been
Johannes
doing.
Niederhauser. Okay.
Yeah, so he's been. They did the lecture series together on technology. And Niederhauser's been, he's a Heidegger scholar. So the piece I sent you is basically what I applied, what I understood from the
Gotcha.
philosopher Heidegger, and his ideas of care and his ideas of technoscience, and compared it to sort of my experiences here in medicine, in like the tip of Africa. Like,
Right. Yeah, I was reading one of the bloggers from some of the sort of the less wrong Star Slate Codex type area. He did I don't know exactly how you call it, but I think he went to Jamaica and was basically, he wasn't a doctor, but he was providing free medical care there. And he said the hardest thing was not necessarily, finding medicine and getting it to the right people, but the culture of healthcare in this particular area was, there was like fundamental misunderstanding about what medicine is and how it treats people. So for like one particular line I remember was someone figured out or thought that um, the more symptoms you tell your doctor, the more medicine you'll get from them, and the better you'll become like healthier. And so some guy overheard a lady talking about her like she might have been PMSing or something or had some pregnancy issue. So then when he went in, he was telling the doctor all these symptoms of like pregnancy in the hopes that he could get the same medicine that the woman got so that he could become more healthy. And I was like, this is so far out of my like experience with the healthcare system. It was pretty wild.
Well, there's that famous story. I think it was sort of the 1920s, and what they were trying to do was, because especially in the ex-colonies, Ethiopia, Central Africa, Kenya, the sort of far removed tribes, they're really like, they've sort of been on their own for quite some time, and they've got these habits, and they realized like a lot of these kids were quite stunted and had rickets, and
Mhm.
like were really malnourished from a young age. And so what they did was they tried to send them food packs, but obviously everything had to be preserved. And what they did was they labeled all the food packs with pictures of what was on the inside. So obviously when they arrived, they got like their peas in the tin and their apples in the tin and all these things in the tin. But when it came to eventually, like 6 or 7 years later, they realized, oh, we need to supply baby food to help just after weaning the softer foods. So what they sent was the purity with like crushed apples and
Mhm.
crushed purity, South African thing, but crushed apples and crushed peanuts. But they put babies on the tins.
Oh no.
And so all these things arrived, and all the tribes sort of abandoned all the food because they thought they were being sent crushed babies.
Oh my God.
And it like
Horrible.
ruined vaccination programs in like so many tribes, like all across Central Africa. It's like,
That's yeah.
but you like some of the things that we that would never come up in the first world. We still see, maybe not where I am, like quite in the south of South Africa, but my friends in the north of South Africa, which is around Mozambique, Zimbabwe. I don't know how much what's going on there politically, but it's a mess. You've got people
Right.
fleeing countries because things are just collapsing, and there's they've seen things like prion protein disease,
Oh, okay. Wow.
from cannibalism,
Yeah.
because there's still cannibalism there, and things like that. Um, and so culturally, it's like this. It's an absolute nightmare here. Like, we have people who believe things about, if you don't have certain things to eat, you can't take medicine. So where I stay is a massive TB and HIV problem, and they believe
Tuberculosis.
that, yeah,
TB. Yeah.
tuberculosis, yeah. So I don't know if you can get that in the US. I think in some places.
So the issue
Uh,
right now we're having is like these anti-vaxxers who, I mean, it started, this was years ago. I was probably still in high school, but there was like a video this woman released where she claimed that getting a vaccine like affected her. She like, it was a YouTube video that some news organization filmed. She would like walk really shaky and sort of crumpled up, but she said that she could run fine. So she would demonstrate like all this happened after the vaccine, and she would be like all shaky, whatever, and then she would run. And then the news organization was like, what was in the vaccine that made her be all crazy? And I showed this to my mom, who's a neurologist, and she was like, obviously this is fake. She's clearly faking. There's nothing that affects you while you're walking, but running magically makes it better. But the other big one, the other big claim was that vaccinations cause Down syndrome, or not Down syndrome because I think that's genetically linked, but like it made kids retarded.
yeah.
And
Oh shoot.
um, obviously that was debunked almost instantaneously, but it's a lot harder to debunk false information than it is to push false information out. And so it's been like a game of whack-a-mole. And the really irritating thing is that there are reasonable scientific reasons to be not skeptical, but like want really good quality control and investigation into what these particular pharma companies are putting into the vaccines, right?
Yeah, sure.
True of any medication. But if you say that now, it's really easy to pigeonhole people like that into the crazy anti-vax camp. And so they've seen the resurgence of these diseases that haven't existed in the US for like a century, out in like California and all of these sort of centers that they're like sort of like neo hippie whatever. They just don't trust the pharmaceutical industry, so they like don't get their kids vaccinated, and then suddenly there's like an outbreak of whooping cough or something, or tuberculosis, right?
Yeah.
And it's just crazy. Like I'm not sure if you should make it a requirement for adults to be vaccinated. I'm particularly, I lean more libertarian in that sense. I don't think the government should force people to get vaccines, but I don't know. Like the fact that there's like kindergartners, I think it would make sense that if you don't get your kids vaccinated, you maybe can't let them go to public school.
Yeah, I mean,
You can homeschool them, something like
we
that.
have like parts of, so we've had this major urbanization of certain areas like around Cape Town where, it used to be sort of stretches of like quite poor, quite poor communities of say 100,000 people, but it's just in the past 20 years it's become from like 100,000 to 1 million people just in these
Wow.
squatter camps. I don't know, squatter camps, is that a South African term?
Yeah, no,
Like
no, I know what you're talking
yeah,
about. But like,
but like
yeah,
slums, yeah.
there's so much like chaos and violence going on in other parts of the continent. And South Africa, for right now, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, is fairly stable and safe, at least in comparison. And so there's obviously a large influx of people, right?
Sure. So Zimbabwe is like a prime example of sort of it's a failed state. So we've got a
Mhm.
lot of Zimbabwean immigrants. We have some people who trekked all the way from Sudan. I've seen some
Wow.
Sudanese refugees. They make it all the way down here. But yeah, I suppose it is a bit more stable for the time being. But not with great prospects for the
The
future.
only thing I saw recently about South Africa, and this was maybe 6 months to a year ago, was, and people were sort of appropriating this news to push their own political agenda in the US. Obviously, in US politics, we're sort of narcissistic and isolationist. Like, if you watch the news here, you would be amazed at how little we give a fuck about other parts of the world. And it's only in context of like their relation to us. It's yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
I hate the mainstream media and like how much they care about what Kim Kardashian is doing and how little they care about literally anywhere else in the world.
It's the
But
same with our media. So don't.
yeah,
It's not just
well,
America.
yeah,
Our media also cares about Kim Kardashian, even though she's
yeah.
all the way up there.
So they talked about how some of these South African farmers, I think Boer descendants,
Food, yeah,
yeah, white South African farmers. There was like all of these sort of break-ins and attacks that were happening, and some people were like horribly, horribly murdered, like in the most brutal way possible. And there was some talk, I think, with your there was some politician who's trying to get elected, and he was talking about uh, basically seizing land and then redistributing it.
yeah,
I think. I don't know
yeah.
any
So
details or the whole
yes,
story, but if you could talk a little bit about that.
sure. So basically, there's I guess the history of South Africa is kind of interesting. I actually read a little bit about it before coming on because I think it's it's like important for context. So everyone knows about Nelson Mandela and apartheid, but basically apartheid was a continuation of what the English did in the colonial years. So it was a separation of legal power. So the idea was that people with dark skin would have their land and have their legal systems, and that white people would have their Western legal systems. But obviously, what happened was the white domination of power, and it was absolute clear
Right.
racially based segregation. Um, there were even like 4 categories of race. You were either black, white, colored, which is a sort of a mixed race, but it's quite specific because it was slaves from Malaysia that were taken to different parts of South Africa, slave labor, and mixed
Okay.
with uh, Cape group of people called Hottentots, which were named the Hottentots by the Dutch, and then
Hottentots are German or
no,
no?
they were locals.
Oh,
Hottentots
okay.
were the locals living there, and they formed this group called Colored, and black, white, colored Indian, and they were Indian slaves as well, imported
Hmm.
during the colonial years, and that sort of developed where eventually uh, there were like tiers, like white is on the top, colored and Indians somewhere in the middle, and blacks on the bottom doing manual labor. They were literally
Wow.
imported into cities for work and had to leave after certain time. So it was like, you know, the way Americans talk about, illegal immigrants doing the dirty work and those things, but it was absolutely legislated that that's the way it worked. Like black
Right.
people were not allowed to own land in certain areas, colored people were only allowed to own land in certain areas, white people. So, and then 94 came, and uh, that was our first democratic election, which was sort of Nelson Mandela coming out of prison, which was, was a US led. It was the civil rights movement in the US which led to sanctions on South Africa and the release of Nelson Mandela from jail, and
How
so
were you?
this
Were you born by that? How old are you?
I was born in 92, so
I was
94 was the
93. So yeah, I was 1. You were 2.
yeah. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. Everything sort of happened in the 90s. I think it's been 30 years since the release of Nelson Mandela from jail. So it happened in
Yeah.
1990 already. But Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress was sort of, and they had an alliance with the Communist Party in Angola, which is Soviet funded as well, but not directly. There wasn't a direct relationship with the Soviet program, more with the Cuban communist program. Um, so basically, almost all South African politics has a very sort of left wing, uh, but really, communist like ideals. So
Right.
it's you'd expect that because it's the kind of view that sees us all as brothers, as
Hmm.
cross-racial divides, and so then what happened was Nelson Mandela made a deal with the old capitalist regime that he wouldn't upset property rights. That was the major deal that Nelson Mandela made with the United States, and we get a lot of aid from the United States, specifically when it comes to HIV. So our HIV program, about 30% of our country, like a third, 1 in every 3 people you meet in South Africa probably has HIV. It might be 20%, so it might be lower than that now,
Oh,
but
snap.
at the height of the epidemic, it was about 1 in 3. Oh, I'm going to have to check that. I know
That's
it was sitting
crazy.
around 20%. So if you walk into a hospital in South Africa, 70% of all patients in a hospital have HIV. It's
That's
unbelievable.
insane.
Yeah. So
I
our
didn't realize
HIV.
it was that bad. Like I've always
Mm,
like had the like yes HIV we have it in the States but it's worse in other parts of the world like Africa but like I 30% that's
yeah, it's. Yeah, I mean, culturally, South African sort of our South African population sort of the what we found was, and this is in the research books is, Westerners tend to have serial monogamy.
hmm
They always used to say black people have just a whole lot more sexual partners than white people, and that's just the way it is. But
right it's
what
more polyamorous or
Yeah,
polygamous or whatever the
well,
word.
that was the thinking, but what the science actually said was black people and white people in South Africa have the same amount of sexual partners in a lifetime, but white people tend to have them in series, whereas black people tend to have them in parallel. So that
Gotcha.
so it's a cultural thing that was spread that was there. Also poverty, which was and poor education. So we weren't able to limit the spread through condom use and having protected sex. And then there was also a major delay in rolling out ARVs. That was a major crisis in our
What
country.
is ARVs?
Antiretrovirals. So
Oh, okay. There's
nevirapine was the big one. So to stop
nevirapine.
vertical transmission from mothers to child. And there was, it was a complicated thing, but our government was so delayed in rolling out ARVs that most of our, a whole lot of the people of childbearing age were infected with HIV.
Wow, that's brutal.
So that's and our whole program is funded by the United States. I think we were supposed to take over funding by 2012, but
Hmm.
we haven't managed. Our government's
I
really
remember reading that some foundation got in trouble for like fake HIV medication. Do you know anything about this?
no, I
Like,
haven't heard
okay,
that. I haven't come into contact with fake HIV medication. We haven't had to roll back anything. It could be. It's possible, but it didn't affect us in the Western Cape. Usually we'd get a notification, please return all these drugs, and we haven't
right,
had any
right,
problems with that. What we have had problems with is mutations and different strains of HIV from Central Africa, but uh, our real problem is, the fact that we're completely dependent on the US for the funding for most of the program, which is,
right.
as effective as you expect a program to be in a poorly run country, which is South Africa is really poorly run.
So is the
Um,
antiretroviral, are those small drug molecules?
so it's a combination of 3 drugs. So all
Yeah,
HIV has,
triflecta or whatever. I
yeah,
heard a lecture from a guy who invented one of the medicines that went into the triple medicine.
yeah, yeah. So it's all of them. Our antiretroviral program is backbone of 3 medications, and then obviously we have a second line, um, which is, I think dolutegravir is the one that's just been rolled out for our first line. But what they what hasn't been advertised well is that for us to maintain the support from the US for the HIV program, we have to maintain property rights. So, which is, a bit spooky.
Yeah,
But now that the debate is to correct the problems that happened in apartheid, which was, land taken away from black people, redistributed to white populations,
right.
the government has to take away property rights because it has to have the right to remove people from land and replace people who are uh, supposed to be on the land,
Right.
descendants of those who were. And I mean, it's obviously chaos because, who gets the land,
How do
which
you
people. You can't
decide
just
that?
say,
How do you decide
yeah, it's,
whose land it is? Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
the
no one
question of
knows.
fairness is very, very subjective. Um,
Well, it's not just
unfortunately.
subjective. It's even if you say, fine, this is a material problem we need to solve. It has been done. So there has been a program that's been done, which, people were offered the choice, financial recompensation or land, and most people chose financial recompensation.
Mm.
And the party driving this is run by a politician, Julius Malema,
Okay.
who who's he's an ex ANC Youth League member, and it seems, as if he is actually just sort of running a communist party. He just wants
Right.
the constitutional power to reclaim land. You know, um, there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions on this, and there's like the debate is just around, yes, we need to fix what happened, but currently we've just got levels of corruption you wouldn't believe in South Africa.
Yeah.
There's this spirit. whenever we hear the Western world talk about South Africa, it's there's always this dialogue of kind of pity.
Yeah.
It's like, shame, these poor people, they're victims, but we can also mess up our own country quite well, and we've been doing that. Our president there's a massive commission on trial where our president literally sold off parts of the state to for massive kickbacks to these private Indian companies,
Hmm.
and he's has a 60-day sick letter where he's been in hospital in Cuba, so he can't appear in court, and it's these just ridiculous things. So to give
Wow.
that kind of government power to take homes away from people is a scary prospect. So that's the only time I think we make US news, is when we threaten property rights.
Well, so that was the point I was making, was like that story about the white South African farmers being attacked and the redistribution of land came to us, but it didn't come through like general news sources. It was like really sort of hard right wingers that like these sort of stories the same way they like the stories from Europe about refugees doing something violent or whatever. They'll repackage that story into like a nice little, for their audience, like red meat of like, look at how bad immigrants are and like all of this racial divide and like they're going to come for your land and probably your guns. And of course that gets eaten up. And then a lot of the news in the US now is like reaction to the reactionaries, and they sort of like, it becomes totally not about the news source. It's almost irrelevant what the story is. It just becomes these two groups of people that are reactionary, and then the counter reactionary force, and then so it becomes a news story about the people responding to the news story. It's a whole whatever.
Yeah, I mean, uh, we actually get almost all your news, which is crazy. I mean,
Right.
we if I was staying in a hotel with my old job, every month, and in all the hotels it would just be Trump impeachment, and like
Is it
I don't know,
CNN or Fox or?
CNN mostly.
Yeah, CNN is everywhere.
It's like, but it has nothing to do with me.
Right.
If Trump got impeached tomorrow, like I'd still have problems. I'd
Right.
still have, like, our country would still have major issues to solve.
Same
But
here.
everyone, like,
There's very little the federal government does that affects me in any way on a day-to-day basis. Like I could, I mean, really, truly, like as long as we stay out of major wars, which we have so far, sort of.
but everyone also has an opinion on it. Like in South Africa, people walk around and they're like, we have an opinion on Trump. We have an opinion on Obama. We have an opinion on American socialized healthcare. We have
Yeah.
like, we
Why?
just get, I don't, I don't
There's
know.
too much
Like
mental energy. I've moved away from commenting or dedicating energy into the day-to-day political stuff in the US. I'm more interested in like meta political discourse, like talking about what systemic things can we do or implement that everyone can get on board with, that are not, it's not a party issue, right?
because it just seems like there was this like great movement some time ago that was, it must have been with the advent of everyone on social media, where everyone like exploded with these like categories of opinions, and you either fall in the one or the other, and that's where the major discourse on the internet goes. But there's also been this underlying thing that I've seen coming up recently, which is that so many people are kind of geared towards small communities again, of people interested in the same things, which has been quite cool as well. I think that's come along with that let's just talk about the things that we like to talk about. And
Right, which is why I'm so positive about indie thinkers, and I really
yeah,
like what Justin Murphy is doing. So it's about a little past noon here, so I'm gonna wrap it up in the next couple of minutes, and then we can really dig into this tomorrow. And what I
sure.
might do is, since I'm recording this, I might clip parts of this and add it onto what we talk about tomorrow. I did think
Okay.
we talked about some interesting stuff, but what I'm going to do is read what you sent me and try to read a little bit more about, South African history and philosophy of care, and definitely check out Johan's Niederhauser, and maybe send you some stuff. But yeah, this time tomorrow,
Cool. Sweet.
I don't really put like a minimum or maximum time limit. So however much time you want to talk for, we'll just go. And if we find that the conversation is sort of a natural ending point, so they get tired, we can end it there, or we can cut it off at like a specific time. So
Cool. Great. It was nice to talk to you. I'll give some of what we've talked about a think and see if I can think of something along the veins of what, just to sound a bit more coherent.
yeah,
What we were talking about. But yeah, it was great to meet you.
it was good to meet you. I was definitely thinking about for the retrovirals, the antiretrovirals, if there was any sort of synthetic biology applications, like if that was something that you could make in bacteria and then brew it like yeast, and like, South Africa could basically be control of their own supply of HIV medication instead of relying on the US in sort of this like weird imperial way. But yeah, it was. We'll do some thinking, and
Cool.
yeah, I mean, the tech looks fine. I'll check the recording and send you what I got. I don't know if you'd be interested in seeing some of the other podcasts that I've recorded, but I'm going to try to do some editing later today and maybe release that on Indie Thinkers. So
Awesome. Cool. Thanks. It was great to chat.
all right, thanks, Camillo. Take it easy.
Sure. Cheers.